On one of our family vacations, we went to one of those museums of oddities, and in one of the rooms, there was this very disorienting effect because when you walked in, everything was upside down. That what felt like it was the floor looked like the ceiling, that the chandeliers and the fans were all sticking straight up, and what looked like the ceiling was actually the floor with the couches and the chairs and all of that. And it created this weird disorientation because you were walking on the ceiling instead of the floor. And this flip side, topsy-turvy kind of situation was really one of those things that messed with your mind. And that feeling is actually the feeling that most Christians that are trying to walk with God feel as they go through life. That the things that God tells them to do are backwards from what the world says. That the wisdom and advice of the world is really backward from what the Bible and God, and of course, Jesus is also God, taught in his teachings during his earthly ministry. And last week, we looked at this idea of the upside down world that we call the kingdom of God. And in this upside down world of God's kingdom, we talked about how generosity leads to prosperity. That in God's kingdom, being generous actually leads to us being prosperous. And that's backwards from the way this world operates. That this world tells us that we should get and get and get and get and hold on to and hoard and keep in order to be prosperous. Now, Jesus didn't teach people that they should be paupers and that we should all be poor, but we should be poor in spirit. That when we're poor in spirit, we inherit the earth. That's what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. And so in this time together, I wanted to look at another upside down world concept, that dying leads to life. That it's only when we go to become dead that we truly begin to live, that death leads to life. And that, of course, is backwards too, because as a hospital chaplain, I've been at the bedside of hundreds, if not thousands of people at this point who have died, and dead people don't come back to life. But when Jesus was talking about death, yes, of course, he wanted the disciples and his followers to know that, yes, they would have to give their life. And many people throughout history that have followed Jesus have given their life as martyrs. But the concept is deeper than that. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus says this, that anyone who wants to be his follower must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. Now, this is the idea of following him in two different ways. Well, of course, Jesus had just told them that he was going to suffer and die through execution. And Peter had said, Lord, this shouldn't be so. And Jesus famously called Peter Satan, right? And the word Satan in Hebrew means adversary. And he's saying, you're being my adversary. You're getting in the way of my mission. And he's not literally calling him Lucifer. But right on the heels of that, Jesus turns and tells the disciples that anyone who wants to be his disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him, because Jesus was about to go to the cross. But it's deeper than that. It's this idea of daily picking up our cross. And this idea of picking up a cross in the time of Jesus, crosses weren't Christian crosses. They were more like a T. And the cross beam of the top of the cross was what a person who was going to be executed by crucifixion would carry. Jesus famously carried it as far as he could, and Simon of Cyrene carried that cross timber the rest of the way. And this would have been a concept they were all too familiar with, because crucifixion was a very common occurrence, especially in Jerusalem, where every rebellion and revolt was put down by the Romans, and they would make an example of these rebellious leaders by publicly executing them by the most gruesome means necessary of crucifixion. So what does this have to do with the upside down world of God's kingdom? Well, it means that you and I, yes, we should love God enough and trust him enough to go to our death, if that's what it takes to be faithful to him. But more than that, you see, most Christians that are sincere would die for Jesus, but it is far more difficult to live for Jesus. And what I mean by that is, when we die to ourselves, we live a lifestyle of putting others above us, that we don't think less of ourselves, we just think of ourselves less. And that we pick up the cross of Jesus, we carry it into this world by dying to these selfish desires, these fears that we all have. And in this death, that's how we truly live. By serving others, by being about God's business, by spreading the kingdom and the gospel of God's message of salvation, that these ways of living, being the hands and feet of Jesus, this actually is what leads to life. So what does this mean for you and me? Well, as we live in perhaps the most selfish culture on the planet and one of the most self-serving periods of history, we must remember that in the upside down world of God's kingdom, death leads to life. That by dying to ourselves, that's when we truly live. Then think about everybody that you've met that got all of the things this world has to offer: power, prestige, and prosperity. As we've talked about before, this doesn't give us peace. And there's nothing wrong with having things. We want to make sure things don't have us. But here's the real crux of what we're talking about today, is that in order for us to live the life of fullness that God has for us, we have to lay down our own desires, pick up the cross to die to ourselves, and live for Him. So in this upside down world of God's kingdom, death is what leads to life. And as counterintuitive as that sounds, let's be a little radical. Put it to the test. Do an experiment. Let's see what living a life of selflessness gets us, dying to ourselves and living for others. And if that leads you and me to feeling empty and worn out and unfulfilled, we can always do it the world's way, but why don't we try it God's way? And I bet you Jesus, like He always is right, that in God's kingdom, the upside down world, death is what leads to life. So until next time, be blessed.